Hello, everyone. This is just a 1-minute warning that we are going to begin in about 1 minute. So please find a comfortable seat and we'll get the proceedings started.
All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Kristen Phillipson. I'm the Minister for Worship and Spiritual Care here at Rosedale United Church. We are a hub supporting human flourishing in our neighborhood and city. On behalf of our board, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this official book launch of For the Sake of the Common Good, Essays in Honor of Lois Wilson. To the very Reverend and Honorable Lois Wilson and her family, and to the passionate and dedicated editors of this project, Kate Merriman and Bertha Yetman, to all of the distinguished essayists and all of them committed leaders in our nation who have given of themselves to their communities and our country in service of common good, and to the respected speakers joining us tonight, and dear friends who are here, welcome. It is a privilege to host this evening's book launch and to participate in educational and cultural events that have supporting human flourishing at their heart. Tonight, that means celebrating Lois Wilson's faith-inspired legacy as a defender of human rights and an activist for peace and social justice. And it means celebrating the editors and essayists' creative work. May this time together inspire and guide all of us. We hope that you'll stay in touch with our hub here at Rosedale United Church and even get involved in some of our own efforts to support the common good and human flourishing, including refugee resettlement and providing warm coats, hot meals, and shelter for people who need them. Thank you for being here for this evening's book launch and this celebration of the legacy and work of Lois Wilson. We hope to see you again. And now I'll invite Reverend Alexa Gilmore and the very Reverend Stan McKay to lead us in a land acknowledgement.
Well, good evening, friends. Welcome. Thank you, Lois, for helping to gather us all here. Thank you, Kate and Bertha. Most of us gathered here are either settlers or visitors to this territory, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Anishinaabeg, and most recently the Mississauga of the New Credit. And most of us are familiar with the words that are spoken at the beginning of a gathering, an acknowledgement of the territory. And most of us recognize that those words only mean something when we pause and when we tie ourselves to the land, to the indigenous siblings that caretaked and welcomed. And so when I offer an acknowledgement of the traditional territory, it changes from moment to moment to offering to offering. And today I've been thinking about my own settlers' relationship to this land and to the places where I was indigenous, my ancestors' homes. And I've been thinking about one branch of my family that was Protestant in a French Catholic country. They were asked and forced to assimilate. They faced violent persecution and they fled. I'm thinking about the ancestors in another branch that were starved out of their homeland and fled. Thinking about another legacy of ancestry that was cleared from my indigenous territory for sheep, because sheep were more profitable than my ancestors. And so those ancestors came here with their trauma, and they were welcomed, and they were shown how to survive, and they were gifted with hospitality, and they responded by starving, by forcing assimilation, by persecuting, by participating in genocide. And coming to a moment of territorial acknowledgement means coming to a moment where truth can be surfaced, choices can be made, and the possibility of healing and reconciliation, like a doorway, opens. So I invite you just to pause as we begin. How do you come to this moment, to this land, to the honoring of our siblings who caretaked for it, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Seneca, the many Anishinaabeg people, and most recently the Mississauga of the New Credit. I bring thanks, and I bring an invitation to living truthfully into the relationship with both the land and one another. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Alexa. And totemitik, my relatives, I acknowledge all of you who are gathered because of a wonderful contribution and a modeling of life, of love incarnate in Lois Wilson. I'm going to say a few words of prayer in my language. But before I do that, I invite you to prayerfully think of the context that we gather in this evening. The context of the trauma of the James Smith Cree Nation, the trauma within what has been known as the British Empire, the trauma in knowing the earth and the natural resources are being plundered and wasted. I realize many of you come from various spiritual backgrounds. I invite you to pray as you are able in your way. Agizemantuaganatsin, Bewichewinan, Soeniminan, Soeniminan, Soeniminan. Minan Sagiwewin, Beth Tagenimwin, Suhatsiwin, Anoskamamuyah. So, Creator, great mystery, we acknowledge this night your purposes for the whole of creation and all of its peoples, all of its diversity. We give thanks for this opportunity to ponder that which might be good and salvific for all peoples in creation and for the creation itself. We ask for your blessing in the four directions. Pe Saweni Minan, Saweni Minan, Saweni Minan, Saweni Minan. Egusi.
I am Bertha Yatman, co-editor with Kate Merriman of For the Sake of the Common Good, Essays in Honor of Lois Wilson. It is noteworthy that yesterday we saw the passing of one of the more celebrated women of our time. And tonight we celebrate the life and work of a very remarkable Canadian woman, the very Honorable Dr. Lois Miriam Wilson. For this, there are many thank yous. We are especially grateful to Reverend Dr. Kristen Phillipson and staff for so generously giving us this lovely Rosedale United Church to host this event free of charge. And I am a Newfoundlander, and we'll look for anything that we can get a bargain out of. That said, we're also grateful to the members of this church community, Gail McNaughton, Cynthia MacDonald, Wendy Dryden, Sandra and Jim Pitt-Blado, and Emma Moore Catering, who have been of major assistance in making this evening possible. And it would be remiss not to overlook those who gave us financial assistance and are not mentioned in the book, in the introduction. They are Dave Walsh, Joy Kagawa, and Sister Anna McNally. And the reason why, as Bernard Lonergan, the Jesuit theologian, said, they came breathlessly and a little late. The book had already gone to press. And as noticed on page 12 of this book, and I will remind you of this book. You're going to be reminded about it throughout the night. But as a retired teacher, it's not so far back in my memory of, I could tell you to open up your books to page 12, but I can almost hear a student of mine echoing from the background, but I don't have a book. Well, they're down there in the back, and the United Church bookstore is here, and they are selling them. But on page 12, it is written that this publication would not have been possible without the financial assistance of the following individuals and organizations: Avanti International, J.O. Chong, John Deacon, Emmanuel College Toronto, Eva Kushner, Loretto Sisters Toronto, Gail McNaughton, Massey College, Toronto, Presentation Sisters of the Blessed Virgin Mary and Sisters of Mercy, St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Sandra Pitt-Blado, Nancy Ruth, the Society of Jesus of Canada, the Canadian province, and the Sisters of St. Joseph's, London. We are grateful for your generosity. Now, this takes me to the next item on the agenda, the making and the contents of the book. And of course, for this, I have the great pleasure to introduce you to Reverend Kate Merriman, co-editor of For the Sake of the Common Good. Kate is also co-author of the introduction to this book. She is an Anglican priest and honorary assistant serving at the Cathedral Church of St. James. She is very active in areas of affordable housing and refugee sponsorship. Kate, despite your editorial caveats, ensure your tenses agree. That's a run-on sentence. Or watch out for dangling participles. They are just desperately chasing a modifier. But it has been a privilege working with you. Your extensive experience in scholarly and academic publishing is so highly respected that, for example, when we submitted our proposal to McGill-Queen's University Press at the beginning of the workday, it was approved by 4 p.m. that day. The email from Kyla Madden, McGill-Queen's managing editor, approving our proposal read, "Kate, it is a pleasure to meet you over email. Of course, I know you by your fine reputation and from years of happy authors. It is lovely to hear from you and to receive your and Bertha Yetman's book proposal for a fest trip for Lois Wilson." And in brackets, "and hello, Bertha." It was then I realized, Kate, you have taken me into the big leagues. I walk in your shadow. Ladies and gentlemen, Kate Merriman.
Thank you, Bertha. That's quite overwhelming. Thank you so much. Oh, I've been told I can be better understood without the mask. Okay. So thank you, Bertha. I'm deeply, deeply touched. I really am. Thanks. It is my happy duty to talk about this unique and wonderful book, and to thank the authors and McGill-Queen's University Press. It was Bertha's inspired idea. It was Bertha's dream. She approached Lois, who agreed, but only on one condition, that the book be about the things she cared about, not about her. And she was very firm on that. At that point, I was invited to join as editor, co-editor. Lois provided names of people to be invited to contribute, and based on their areas, an outline emerged in 3 sections: ecumenical and interfaith developments, number 1, number 2, faith and public policy, and number 3, human rights. Some of the names you will hear me provide will be very familiar names. Others you will not be familiar with at all. But all deserve recognition for their work for the common good. Now, a foreword is written to commend a book by someone who is not one of the authors, who has expertise in the field, and whose name and word carry weight. We were very fortunate that Louise Arbour wrote the foreword for the book. And afterward reflects on the past from the point of view of the present and looks ahead to how we carry on work into the future. Michael Blair, General Secretary of the United Church of Canada, has done this with great grace. Alan Saunders, lifelong friend of Lois and also a United Church minister, introduces us to Lois, focusing in particular on how her faith has influenced her life and work. Now, turning to those three main sections, beginning with ecumenical and interfaith developments. Religions of all stripes, at least in my experience, are more often thought of as divided and divisive than cooperative. The authors in this section, in contrast, have found that there is great power and healing in bridging divides and in celebrating diversity. Chris Ferguson, at the time of writing, General Secretary of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, gives an overview of the ecumenical movement, elaborating on the Greek oikumene, the word at the basis of ecumenism, meaning the whole inhabited world. Eric Weingartner, the first Canadian and the first NGO representative to achieve resident status in North Korea, describes ecumenical cooperation among churches in North and South Korea. Diana Eck is professor of comparative religion and Indian studies at Harvard. She analyzes a week-long interfaith gathering of women religious leaders to identify what is distinctive about women's perspective in interfaith dialogue. Alia Hogben served as executive director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, and in her chapter she reviews the challenges facing this group and its contributions to Canadian society. Sean Mulrooney reaches deep into Christian spiritual tradition to present Visio Divina, a guided method for contemplating a piece of art. He has introduced this practice to both theology students at the University of Toronto and people experiencing homelessness and addiction. He has found that it deepens individual spirituality and promotes dialogue across creedal differences. Section 2, Faith and Public Policy. Now here's a hotly debated topic, if ever there was one. It conjures up separation of church and state, the political clout of the American evangelical right, the Taliban in Afghanistan, the power of Roman Catholic bishops in some parts of the world, and so on and so on. Perhaps it would be best just to avoid the topic altogether. But Bill Blakey, Lloyd Axworthy, and Mary Jo Leddy say, yes, faith has a place in forming public policy. Blakey, distinguished Canadian parliamentarian and United Church minister, speaks about an ultimate reality that intends in the first place that we should live with and love one another. Axworthy, Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Chrétien government and now chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council, contrasts this vision, so beautifully expressed by Blakey, with how refugees are being stereotyped as security threats, left voiceless, and end up last in the queue for resources. Scholar and journalist Letty, from her vantage point at Romero House, a community that welcomes and supports refugee claimants, invites Canadians to see our borders not as barriers, but as blessings. Is this place on earth an object that we own, or is it a gift to be shared? How we answer this question, she says, will determine how we see our borders, as protective barriers or as the markers of our area of responsibility for the earth. Alexa Gilmore and Betsy Anderson moved the discussion of faith and public policy to the local level. Gilmore describes how one congregation in Toronto's West End embraced a costly discipleship to be in solidarity with at-risk strangers. Anderson looks at the ministry of the laity in very particular places, with a focus on the lay-led student Christian movement that has deeply influenced the growth of the student left in Canada. The chapters by Stephen Sharper, Director of the Integrated Sustainability Initiative at Trinity College, Stan McKay, member of the Fisher River First Nation and first Indigenous moderator of the United Church of Canada, and Bertha Yetman, at one time Executive Director of the Newfoundland Inshore Fisheries Association. These three deal with the interrelationships among faith, justice, and the environment. Both Yetman and McKay recount how colonialism, greed, mismanagement, and the prioritizing of wealth over human dignity resulted in the destruction of sustainable ways of life. In the case of Newfoundland, of course, the world's richest cod fishery, and indigenous self-sustaining communities. Sharper tells the stories of faith communities working to restore creaturely solidarity. In McKay's words, to live respectfully on the earth with all creation. 3, human rights. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, begins, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, ... We are still, I'm sure we all recognize, a long way from making that recognition a reality. Brent Hawkes, longtime pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto, and Kimberly Vance Mubanga, former president of EGAL Canada and executive director of ARC, take a global perspective on human rights for LGBT+ people, noting, for example, that consensual same-sex activity continues to be illegal in 35% of UN member nations. Shocking. Aruna Gnadison, national convener of the Indian Christian Women's Movement, former director of the World Council of Churches Women in Church and Society, and Noah Mendelsohn Aviv, the executive director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, look at the challenges confronting human rights organizations. Gnadison reflects on an internal challenge for global feminism, namely, third world feminism is often not recognized as such. And she asks, is it because burqa or sari or kanga cloth-clad feminists do not fit into the normal definitions or understandings of who a feminist is? Mendelsohn Aviv looks at external challenges, in particular, the co-optation and subversion of the term cancel culture, a concept that originated among Black Twitter users as a way of holding powerful individuals responsible for their wrongdoings. Irwin Cotler, Attorney General and Minister of Justice in the Chrétien government, now chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, presents 5 case studies of political prisoners and asks, what can democracies under stress do? I'll let him elaborate in his keynote address. Thank you, authors, for your rich contributions and enduring testimony to a remarkable life. And now I turn to our publisher, McGill Queen's University Press. When we submitted a book proposal, I was not hopeful. Because of my years in the business, I know that festschrifts, collections of essays in honor of somebody, are not an easy sell. They are not, no matter what the quality is. So, Amazed and delighted are not adequate to express how I felt, and I think I can speak for Bertha, when McGill Queens agreed to publish. Their requests for revisions made the book better, and they guided us carefully every step of the way. I'd like to thank Ruth Pinko, our superb indexer. And thanks to Kyla Madden, Acquisitions Editor, Kathleen Fraser, Managing Editor, and Ellie Stiliano and staff in the Marketing Department. So, Bertha's dream has become a reality. Lois Wilson's example and her work on behalf of the common good continue in the lives and writings of the authors and in the lives of all who read the book. Thank you very much. Thank you. I now invite Noah Mendelsohn Aviv to introduce our keynote speaker, Erwin Kotler.
Good evening, everybody. I told Professor Kotler that I would keep this short, but when I looked at his list of accomplishments, I discovered that was not going to be possible. Professor Erwin Kotler is the founder and international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and an emeritus professor of law at McGill University and former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada and longtime member of Parliament and an international human rights lawyer and, if I may add, a former board member of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. As a constitutional and comparative law scholar, Professor Kotler is the author of numerous publications and seminal legal articles and has written upon and intervened in landmark charter rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. As Minister of Justice and Attorney General, this one's really long, Erwin Kotler initiated the first ever comprehensive reform of the Supreme Court appointment process and helped make it the most gender representative Supreme Court in the world. He appointed the first ever Indigenous and visible minority justices to the Ontario Court of Appeal. He initiated the first ever law on human trafficking. He crafted the Civil Marriage Act, which was the first ever law in Canada to grant marriage equality to members of the 2S LGBTQI+ communities. He issued the first National Justice Initiative against racism and hate. He quashed more wrongful convictions in a single year than any prior minister. And he made the pursuit of international justice a government priority. As a parliamentarian, he has been the chair of the first ever Assembly of Parliamentarians for the International Criminal Court, chair of Parliamentarians for Global Action Canada, chair of the Interparliamentary Group for Human Rights in Iran, chair of the Interparliamentary Group of Justice for Sergei Magnitsky, chair of the All-Party Save Darfur Committee Parliamentary Coalition, co-chair of the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism, and chair Canadian section of the Parliamentarians for Global Actions and member of its International Council. And as an international human rights lawyer who has been characterized as counsel for the oppressed, he has represented high-profile prisoners of conscience and political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, Andrei Sakharov, Natan Sharansky, Jacobo Timmerman, and Professor Saad Eddin Ibrahim. He currently serves as counsel to Iranian human rights lawyer Nasrin Sotoudeh, Saudi blogger Raif Badawi, Swedish Eritrean journalist Dawit Isaak, and Venezuelan judge Maria Lourdes Effiuni, among others. And you can read about some of that in his fascinating and astonishing chapter in the book that we are here to celebrate tonight. Professor Kotler is a Privy Councillor and Officer of the Order of Canada, the recipient of numerous awards and honorary doctorates in Canada and around the world, which I will not take you through. But I will say that he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by former Prime Minister Paul Martin, as well as leaders of other political parties. Professor Kautler is humble, funny, and indefatigable in his pursuit of human rights. While unwell and unable to be here, while he is supposed to rest, he is only making the keynote address tonight. He only took a meeting with me earlier this week and only concluded our lengthy and really delightful conversation because he was meeting with colleagues with whom he is advocating critical international human rights cases, and that's only the stuff that I know. Professor Kautler is a Canadian human rights hero. As we gather here to honor Canadian human rights hero Lois Wilson, who is also a longtime supporter and former board member of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, we are extremely fortunate to have with us as our keynote speaker, Professor Irwin Kautler.
Noah, thank you for those very kind words of introduction. I have to say that I have the best of memories of my association with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and your predecessor, Alan Borovoy of blessed memory, one of my oldest and best of friends, who would be delighted that you are his successor. And I'm pleased, indeed privileged, to participate in this celebratory launch of the book of essays for the sake of the common good, essays in honor of Lois Wilson, who evokes, embodies the common good, with whom I had the pleasure to work together when I was a member of Parliament and she a member of the Senate, where one of my most inspiring experiences as a member of Parliament was to be able to co-chair the Parliamentary House Senate Human Rights Caucus with Lois Wilson, and to be inspired, engaged, empowered by her moral clarity, her courage, her commitment, her fidelity to all things good. And I'm delighted, therefore, to be able to join her, to join all those assembled here, and to Kate and Bertha, my appreciation for your yeoman editorship and stewardship of this project. We meet, as my own essay in the book spoke of, an important historical inflection moment where we are witnessing a global political pandemic characterized by a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, assaults on human rights, including media freedom, and where political prisoners are a looking glass into that global political pandemic, indeed underpinned by yet another pandemic, the pandemic of impunity, which only incentivizes further human rights violations. In my essay for the book, I focused, as has been mentioned, on 5 case studies and the political prisoners respectively serving as a looking glass. Those case studies were Putin's Russia, Xi Jinping's China, Khamenei's Iran, Maduro's Venezuela, and Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia. This evening, for reasons of time and dramatic changes that have occurred since I wrote the essay, I will focus on 3 case studies. Putin's Russia, with Vladimir Kara-Murza, the imprisoned Russian dissident and democratic opposition leader, as a case study, of Xi Jinping's China and 2 Chinese Canadians as case studies, and Khamenei's Iran, or I might add, since the essay was written now, Ibrahim Raisi's Iran, now the president of Iran, but who as a deputy prosecutor presided as one of the members of the Death Commission in 1988, responsible for the execution of thousands of Iranian dissidents, and where September 1st has been set aside by a motion moved by Paul Duer, then of the NDP party, also of blessed memory, that I had the pleasure of co-sponsoring, to establish September 1 as Iranian Political Prisoner Day, which we just commemorated, to both remember and be reminded of those deadly assassinations of 1988, not only the impunity that has attended them, but in fact the rewards, as Ibrahim Raisi, then the deputy prosecutor and member of that death squad of 1988, went on to become the Attorney General, to become the Chief Justice, and now the President of Iran. Under his leadership, we have also witnessed the highest level of extrajudicial executions, imprisonments, and the like. May I begin now with Putin's Russia, where we have entered the 7th month of Russia's unprovoked and premeditated criminal invasion of Ukraine. When I wrote the essay, the invasion had not yet taken place. But what we have been witnessing has been an ongoing criminal aggression underpinned by brutal mass atrocities, of ongoing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and indeed incitement to genocide, which is itself a standing breach of the Genocide Convention, whether or not acts of genocide follow, of ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity that have included the bombing of hospitals, schools, clinics, cultural centers, religious institutions, humanitarian corridors, where Mariupol and Bucha have become metaphors and messages of those assaults, where we have witness and evidence of torture and rape and pillage and mass deportation of Ukrainians, the whole and accompanied, as I mentioned, by a standing incitement to genocide, which finds expression in Putin's characterization of his invasion as being brought about for the need to, quote, denazify the Ukraine. Yet another assault not only on the political independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine, but on the people of Ukraine itself. The attempt to eradicate the identity of the people of Ukraine, and to do so in an Orwellian inversion that Putin is doing nothing other than denazifying the Ukraine. And so is our report, the report of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, along with the New Lines Institute, published in late May, endorsed by leading international and genocide scholars all over the world, determined, number one, that Russia is in standing breach of the prohibition against incitement to genocide under the Genocide Convention. Two, that its mass atrocities, war crimes, and crimes against humanity have given rise to a reasonable risk of genocide. And three, that state parties to the Genocide Convention thereby have a responsibility, a duty to prevent and protect against genocide. And while the military, political, humanitarian, diplomatic, and economic assistance is necessary and urgent, we need to be engaged in securing justice for the Ukrainian people and accountability for the human rights violators and Putin's crimes of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And while there are initiatives as we meet before the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, national prosecutions, at this point, the crime of aggression does not come within the jurisdiction of any of the aforementioned initiatives. And so I am party to a group which has just published a white paper on the need for a special international tribunal for the crime of aggression. And I hope that Canada will take the lead along with the community of democracies, where the Parliamentary Assembly of the Community of Democracies has endorsed such an initiative, to bring about an international tribunal for the crime of aggression, so that we secure not only justice for the victims, but we secure accountability for those engaged in that crime of aggression. And that brings me to the political prisoner, the looking glass into all this, into both Russia's domestic repression and its external aggression. I'm speaking here of Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian author, journalist, dissident, and leader of the Russian democratic opposition, and where there is a close Canadian connection to Vladimir Kara-Murza's case. He first came to Canada in 2012 along with Boris Nemtsov, then the democratic opposition leader in Russia, to support my tabling of Magnitsky legislation at the time. Boris Nemtsov was tragically himself assassinated outside the Kremlin in February 2015. Our Foreign Affairs Committee in the Canadian Parliament convened with respect to the adoption of Magnitsky legislation in 2015 thereafter, and Vladimir Kara-Murza was a principal witness. He went back to Russia, was poisoned, and almost died. In 2017, the Foreign Affairs Committee convened again. Vladimir Kara-Murza, having survived that assassination attempt, came in once again, was a principal witness, and this time Canada moved to adopt Magnitsky legislation. But when Vladimir Kara-Murza returned to Russia, he was poisoned yet again and miraculously survived. Fast forward to March of this year, right after the Russia invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who had been dividing his time between Russia and Washington, where he is also a contributing editor to the Washington Post, went back to Russia because, as they put it, to be with his people on that occasion, and went back and protested Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. In April, he was arrested just as he was about to return to Washington for, quote, disobeying police orders, the first of a series of trumped-up charges. He was then charged with deliberately spreading false information, the false information being the critique of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a charge which carries a 15-year sentence of imprisonment with it, and since then has been charged yet again with being an agent of a foreign organization. In a word, a series of trumped-up charges, so that as we meet, Vladimir Kara-Murza is awaiting the outcome of those charges, seriously induced and created because of his critique of both domestic repression in Russia and external aggression against the Ukraine. And so in standing with Vladimir Kara-Murza, we give expression to support for democracy and human rights within Russia, and for accountability for its criminal aggression in the Ukraine outside Russia. Which brings me now to the second case study, and that is of Xi Jinping's China, where Xi Jinping, like Putin, I use those terms to distinguish it from the people of Russia and the people of China, who are otherwise the targets of their massive domestic repression and external aggression, where Xi Jinping has characterized what he calls the 5 sins, but where those 5 sins have found expression in Xi Jinping's targeting of 5 communities, of 5 violations of a massive character. The first are the mass atrocities targeting the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region of China, mass atrocities which the Canadian Parliament became the first to determine were atrocities constitutive of genocide. And here too, our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights published a report to that effect, endorsed by some 50 leading genocide scholars, that what is happening in the Xinjiang region of China as we meet are mass atrocities constitutive of genocide. Second, a frontal assault, not only on the democracy movement, but on democracy itself in Hong Kong, where the national security legislation adopted not only criminalizes domestic speech, but actually has engaged in externalized and transnational repression, as Freedom House recently reported. Third has been the persecution and prosecution of the Falun Gong, now in its 23rd year, a spiritual and religious meditative group that have been themselves become the ongoing targets, as I mentioned, of persecution and prosecution, imprisonment, and the like. The fourth is the repression of Tibet. And finally, we have the menacing of Taiwan. But it doesn't end there. What is less well known is that the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, imprisons more journalists than any other country in the world, that it imprisons the lawyers who would defend them, that it is engaged in standing breaches of the Declaration of Arbitrary Detention in state-to-state relations, whose adoption was led by Canada in February 2021, and where China is in standing breach. And as we meet, Chinese Canadians, dual nationalities, the subject of this declaration on arbitrary detention, stand unjustly in prison. I will mention just two. One is Dr. Wang Bizang, a doctor from China who received his PhD in McGill from McGill University in 1982. He decided, while that it would be good to be a doctor, it was more important to mobilize for a democracy movement for China. And so he established the Overseas China Democracy Movement. On a trip to Vietnam in 2002, he was abducted from Vietnam, brought back to China, and in a secret trial was charged and convicted of both the charges of treason and terrorism, and is now in his 23rd year in a China prison, where he has suffered a series of debilitating strokes, and where his daughter, Tiana Wang, herself named after Tiananmen Square, a graduate of McGill Law School, and who's been mobilizing for her father's release, sought to visit him after being repeatedly denied a visa. But when in 2019 finally got a visa, was cruelly returned back to Canada after she landed in Beijing with her infant son, never to be able to visit her father, who has suffered, as I said, a series of debilitating strokes in prison. And we have Hussein Jalil, a Chinese Canadian Uyghur, whose case I first took up as a parliamentarian in 2006, just as I took up Dr. Wang Bizang's case in 2002, who was himself abducted from Kazakhstan, brought back to China, himself sentenced in a sham and secret trial, both of them victims and case studies of the Chinese injustice system. Which brings me now to the third and final case study, and that is of Khamenei's Iran, where, as I said, President Ibrahim Raisi of the Death Squad Commission that sentenced thousands of Iranian dissidents to death in 1988, now is not only president of Iran, having gone from deputy prosecutor to attorney general to chief justice to president, but where he also presided as chairman over the inquiry into the downing of Ukrainian airliner PS-752, on board which were Iranian Canadians, permanent residents, in Canada, a horrific tragedy which a Ontario court referred to as an act of terrorism, but which Ibrahim Raisi whitewashed and sanitized as the chair of the inquiry into that report. But I want to speak here of the case of political prisoner of Nasrin Sotoudeh, whose case, along with other parliamentarians, I first took up in 2011 during her first arrest and sentenced then to some 10 years in prison. After she was released some 3.5 years ago, Nasrin Sotoudeh became once again a political prisoner. This is a woman who has been called the Mandela of Iran, a woman who is an iconic woman, human rights lawyer who's gone down the line for women's rights and the human rights movement in Iran, who's gone down the line for juveniles destined for execution, down the line for journalists whose freedom of speech has been silenced, down the line for environmentalists who've been persecuted and imprisoned for seeking nothing other than to protect the environment, down the line for persecuted minorities like the Baha'i, whose persecution and prosecution has been enhanced in recent weeks, down the line for other lawyers imprisoned for defending political prisoners, and down the line for other political prisoners until she herself became yet again a political prisoner 3.5 years ago, sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, a virtual death sentence for a woman in her late 50s. This woman embodies the struggle for human rights in Iran, and it behooves us to stand with her. And may I close at this point with a few priorities that ought to underpin our advocacy in terms of what we ourselves can do, and which this book of essays should inspire us, particularly as Lois Wilson has shown us how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil and in that way change history. Number one, we must hold the resurgent global authoritarians to account, combat the culture of criminality and corruption and impunity which underpin them, secure, as I mentioned, justice for victims and accountability for human rights violators. And one of the most effective remedies here is the implementation of what is now global justice for Sergei Magnitsky sanctions through the use of visa bans, through the use of asset seizures, which will protect not only our own security here in Canada, but help to bring about accountability for the violators, and as I said, justice for the victims. Number two, we need to promote and protect the institutions and values of democracy now under assault. 5 years ago, I became one of the signatories of the Prague Declaration on Democratic Renewal, itself reaffirmed just recently at the Forum 2000 conference in the Czech Republic, where, as I quote from its thematic refrain, it said, "Democracies everywhere are under threat, and all of us who care about democracy must come to its defense." Democracy is under threat, under heightened threat, even since the Prague Declaration was formulated 5 years ago. And I still remember my first job was back in 1968 for then Justice Minister John Turner. And he taught me a lesson that I never forgot. And it was a lesson that he gave expression to as a parliamentarian when he said, democracy doesn't happen by accident. You have to work at it. You have to persevere at it. You have to engage in its promotion and protection. And that too is yet another expression and manifestation of Lois Wilson's commitment to the greater good. Number three, we need to, at this point, protect, as the book's essays also speak about, affirm and protect faith and religious freedom, which Chief Justice Dixon once called the firstness of our freedoms, in speaking of freedom of religion, and the interrelationship, as has been mentioned, between faith, justice, and environment, and how all those values are themselves embraced by our Indigenous peoples, for whom Indigenous justice must be a priority in our work. Number 4, we must realize that what made the Holocaust and the genocide and the mass atrocities that followed, what makes them so horrific, are not only the horrors of the genocide themselves. What makes them so horrific is that these genocides were preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Nobody could say that from April to the beginning of July 1994, where 1 million Rwandan Tutsis were murdered, 10,000 every day for 3 months, nobody could say we did not know, as the UN Security Council dithered and delayed, and only Romeo Dallaire stood up on behalf of the targeted Tutsis at the time. And so when it comes to matters of mass atrocity, when we speak of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide, we have to remember that indifference and inaction, as my mentor, Professor Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Laureate, always warned us about, that indifference and inaction always means coming down on the side of the victimizer, not on the side of the victim. And it's our responsibility to stand up and be counted and not look around to see whoever else is standing before we make a decision to do so, because in the world in which we live, there are few who are prepared to stand and to speak out and to act as is warranted and required. Number 5, and moving to a close, we need to stand up on behalf of the political prisoners, those that I mentioned and others that I have not mentioned, who serve as a looking glass into the global political pandemic, into the culture of impunity, whose pain and plight I sought to summarize this evening and in the essay that I wrote to the book. It's our responsibility to speak on behalf of those who cannot be heard, to bear witness on behalf of those who cannot testify, to act on behalf of those who are putting not only their livelihood, but their lives on the line, and putting their lives on the line for democratic values, institutions, fundamental freedoms that we seek to aspire to promote and protect. And finally, to promote and protect the values, rights, and institutions that underpin the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Recently, we commemorated the 40th anniversary of the Charter. And I recall being present with thousands on Parliament Hill in Ottawa in April 1982, when Queen Elizabeth signed the Constitution Act. And I recall also when on the 10th anniversary of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Chief Justice Lamer spoke of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as being a revolutionary act comparable to the discoveries of Pasteur in science. And while we may feel that that was a burst of enthusiasm, let us not ignore the compellability and importance of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in securing a democratic Canada. And recalling also at this moment Queen Elizabeth's visit to Canada, Queen Elizabeth of blessed memory, with her dignity and grace, devotion to public service and duty. And if it is a revolutionary act, if the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is to be seen as a revolutionary act, we have to affirm and protect the underlying values, rights institutions that will protect our democracies from within and without, and stand with the Kara-Murzas of Russia, the Wang Dezhangs of China, the Nasrin Sotoudehs of Iran, to let them know that they are not alone, that they are not alone in their struggle for democracy, that we stand in solidarity with them, that we will not relent in our advocacy until these prisoners are released and democracy and rights and justice and faith are secured. Thank you.
We have two respondents. The first will be Mary Jo Letty, and then followed by Eric Weingartner.
Thank you, Erwin. We are really grateful for those words. Thank you. I suspect when Kate Merriman started to think about this book and the theme began to emerge, the common good, she looked around and considered people who knew something about the common good, who had struggled as Erwin has, and others struggled to make that good real and strong. Erwin and Lois have everything to teach us about the common good, that it's real, that it's commanding, that it's demanding. It's real enough to imagine it as a place, a purpose, and a passion. In her magnificent novel, Gilead, the great American writer Marilynne Robinson tried to describe how God teaches us about the common good. And she described God as a mother looking at her child and saying to that child, I pray that you grow up a brave man in a brave country. I pray you find a reason to be grateful, a way of being useful. Let me repeat that in a more non-gendered way. I pray that you grow up as a brave woman in a brave country. I pray that you may find a way to be useful. It takes brave men and women to construct a brave country. And all of us know that Erwin and Lois have been bold and brave in defending the rights of others. I have seen their bravery and their courage in the halls of our Parliament, where they spoke up and strongly spoke about the people who could no longer speak. And Lois and Erwin have taught us so much about what it means to be useful, not flashy, not important, but useful. It's what happens when you start to build institutions, to write policy papers, to craft policies that make a difference. To be useful also means being at the right place in the right time with the right person. And this is called useful. It's because it matters. It's humble, consistent, and caring. And Lois, whom we honor tonight, is brave. And some would call her gutsy. Some would say a troublemaker. But it's good trouble. She mixes it up. It's good trouble. And Erwin and Lois, we celebrate tonight this book, your words. May we be brave in a brave country. And may we find, each one of us, a way to be useful.
Wow, I must say, this presentation blew me away. Before I respond to Irvin Kotler's inspiring but also disturbing presentation, I want to thank Kate and Bertha for shepherding this project to such a satisfying conclusion. And also thank you, Lois, for suggesting I be a part of this. It's an honor. I want to focus my remarks on three areas that have preoccupied me to an increasing extent in recent years. The first is of a conceptual nature, the second is pragmatic, and the third is more personal. Now, while reading this book that we are celebrating today, For the Sake of the Common Good, it struck me how often the theme of human rights came up in various essays far beyond the section dealing specifically with human rights. Of course, it's easy to assume that human rights are a necessary part of the common good. But in fact, there has always been an uneasy tension between these concepts, largely because human rights always challenge prevailing assumptions about what constitutes the common good. It might even be argued that human rights emerged as a weapon in the battle between conflicting conceptions: the bourgeoisie versus absolute monarchy, minorities versus majorities, individuals versus communities, and so on. This adversarial nature of human rights has often been abused. An example is the fanaticism around the right to bear arms south of the border. Human rights has even been used as a slogan to oppose measures that are clearly meant to advance the common good. How else to understand the absurdity of the freedom convoy that has infected several cities in Canada? There are obviously those who believe individual freedoms outrank communal requirements. Now, I want to clarify, although I have worked in the field of human rights, I am not a lawyer. My training was in theology, specifically Lutheran theology. And you might be aware that Lutherans are big on distinguishing between the law and the gospel. The law tells me what I did wrong and prescribes punishment. The gospel tells me that God loves me anyway and prescribes redemption. In this conception, the law shows me how my behavior has broken down relationships within the community. But punishment is incapable of restoring relationships. For that to happen requires redemption, forgiveness. In other words, good news. That may be the reason why I have always felt uncomfortable with the notion that human rights must necessarily be framed within a crime and punishment context. Because I am not a lawyer, I lack the legal imagination to fit the concept of rights comfortably into an effort to heal divisions and reverse the scourge of polarization that is tearing us apart locally and internationally. I do realize there are other legal models that don't rely on the adversarial contest that seems so central to our court systems. In her essay on human rights, Dr. Noah Mendelssohn-Aviv proposes the concept of pragmatic solidarity, which I find very attractive. As she describes it, pragmatic solidarity seeks to complement accountability with inclusivity and intersectionality. So my first question boils down to this. Assuming that the common good is based on the vision of a common human community, can we rescue human rights from our tendency to fragment social connections? Are human rights necessarily confrontational and divisive? My second question has to do with contexts and priorities. Human rights may be universal, but the contexts in which human rights are promoted or violated are always very local. To be effective, the methods we choose to promote human rights must take into account prevailing local, national, and regional contexts. To give one example that I'm much familiar with, an extreme context like North Korea has a tendency to bring out the extremes in people who try to deal with it. When I started working in Pyongyang, I discovered a major disconnect between human rights organizations and those providing humanitarian aid. Both, or so I thought, were efforts to advance the common good. The right to food, after all, is a basic human right. What I discovered is that differences in organizational goals, not to mention differences in sources of funding, led to differences in understanding the context, and therefore differences in priorities for action. To oversimplify, on one extreme, you have the humanitarians willing to make compromises with a despicable regime in order to meet the immediate needs of a starving people. While on the other extreme, you have human rights activists intent on regime change at the risk of unleashing sanctions, violence, and even war on an already suffering population. When I look at the global scene, or even here in Canada, I see extremism spreading like a plague. Why is that? I believe it's a reaction to the context of multiple global threats that we are facing. As Lloyd Axworthy puts it in his essay, Last in the Queue, and I quote, "The world is experiencing a situational septic tank of mass migration, food and water shortages, civil conflicts, and the spread of extremists. It's an existential threat." End of quote. To my mind, combating the polarization we are currently facing is of highest priority because the magnitude of our problems requires more local, national, and international cooperation than ever before in human history. And setting priorities is one of the main tasks of politics. And you, Irwin Cotler, are a person of vast political experience. How can we set priorities that will bring us together rather than push us to extremes? Is a democratic system that sees itself as competition among mutually exclusive political platforms capable of mobilizing the broad spectrum cooperation that is needed for us to save the common good? Finally, to my personal question. I recently came upon a quote by Lieutenant General the Honorable Romuald Dallaire, who has also been mentioned already. And he said the following: "The lack of hope in the future is the root cause of rage. If we cannot provide hope for the untold masses of the world, then the future will be nothing but a repeat of Rwanda, Sierra Leone, the Congo, and September 11. I looked in the index of the book for the word hope. It is missing. However, pretty much every chapter projects some level of confidence in our ability to solve problems for the sake of the common good. In the chapter on the global women's movement, my former WCC colleague, Aruna Gnanadasan, has a lengthy paragraph listing the multiple fears that people of the world are facing. And she rightly states that fear is a major tool of domination and discrimination. Now, I am by nature an optimistic person. As a young man back in the 1960s, I was confident that we could end domination and discrimination and restore hope in the future. But as an old geezer, I must confess that over the decades, my optimism has taken a severe beating. Human rights work in particular, I find emotionally draining, especially when it comes to supporting individuals whose rights have been trampled upon, like the ones Irwin Cotler has highlighted here tonight. No matter how hard we work at it, the numbers keep on growing. My wife, Marilyn, a nurse by profession, says working human rights cases like you, Irwin, and Lois have done is like working in the emergency department of a hospital. For every kid with gunshot wounds that you save, 2 others are waiting in line to be treated. No wonder so many emergency workers have experienced burnout during the current pandemic. So here's my personal question. How do you, Irwin Cotler, Maintain your passion, your emotional energy in the face of insurmountable obstacles and the reality that the number of human rights cases continues to increase despite your best efforts. You obviously haven't lost your hope in the future of humanity. Could you share some of that hope with the rest of us, please? Thank you.
I will be very brief in my responses and just leave with two lessons that I learned from my first teachers, my parents of blessed memory. And they embodied for me themselves role models for what faith and hope and justice were all about. It was my father who taught me, while I was still a young boy, unable to really appreciate the profundity of his message, when he said to me that the commandment, justice, justice shall you pursue, as he put it, is equal to all the other commandments combined. This must be your life's credo. This must be that which you teach onto your children. This must be your obligation through generations. But it was my mother, when she heard my father saying these things to me, would say to me that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice will remain a theoretical abstraction. And so it's a result of the teachings of my parents and then the good educators that I had thereafter in high school and university that I got involved in two of the great human rights movements of our time in the 70s. The first being the struggle for human rights in the then former Soviet Union, and the second, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and got involved with the two political prisoners who represented the voice, the face, the vision of those struggles, Anatoly Sharansky in the former Soviet Union and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And those two taught me the importance of commitment, of hope, that the pursuit of justice is not done in a day, but that the arc of history will ultimately bend towards justice if we each individually and collectively do that which we must and that which I trust we will. Thank you.
Now, this is the moment you've all been waiting for. Who said that? Anybody want a free book? It was written for me by Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. Who was it? Who said it? Nobody can help me? It is the evening of the day. Do you remember that? Tears go by. Anyway, this is the moment. It is the moment for us to pay tribute to Lois. Lois, there are two people will be giving her this tribute, Lois Adamson and Reverend Alan Saunders. Lois Adamson, Lois Wilson's namesake, is one of Lois Wilson's 12 grandchildren. And she is mother to 2 of her great-grandchildren. She is Jean Wilson's daughter, and she is Director of Education at Stratford Festival. Her love of theater is something she attributes to both her grandmother and her grandfather, who, from a young age, made theater going a regular and important part of her life. Reverend Alan Saunders has served United Church pastors in Western Canada and has shared a friendship with Lois for more than 40 years. He is the author of the opening chapter on the personal faith of Lois's life and work. Now you can come up, and Lois will come and sit down here.
Thank you, Bertha, for that kind introduction. Oh, I think you're trying to make Grandma sit somewhere else. So thank you, Bertha. To further clarify, I am now somewhat ironically little Lois, one of Lois Wilson's grandchildren and one of her daughter Jean's 2 children, and 2 of her other grandchildren are here tonight, and I know lots are on Zoom as well. It's truly an honor, along with Alan Saunders, to offer a few words on this special occasion. I'm happy to speak in place of my mum, Jean Wilson, who, much to her regret, couldn't be here, but has written some remarks for me to share on her behalf. There's much to celebrate, and much that my mum could say about our honoree, but she knew my grandmother would be happy if we kept it brief. Alan, on the other hand, my mom thinks should say as much as he likes. As you can tell from his splendid piece in the book, he's well equipped to do the heavy lifting here. And some of this has been touched on a little bit, but the volume began seriously to take shape in April 2020, when my grandmother, who had turned a mere 93 years old on April 8th that year, came to live with my mum in Hamilton. The pandemic had just been declared, and aware that if she were to succumb to COVID, it would mean dying virtually alone in Christie Gardens. Much as she loves the place, she decided to decamp to her daughter's home, so if need be, we could all, and I quote, come to see her when she was dying. Classic. Needless to say, she did not die, nor did she stay idle, not even a hint of pandemic worry, isolation, boredom, or fatigue. She read every book on my mom's shelves, and there are a lot of them, often in the backyard where she gloried in the spring flowerings and especially marveled at the trees, went for regular walks in the neighborhood, enjoyed driveway visits from friends and family, participated in online church services with my mom. They sang the hymns together, took turns reading the call to worship, scripture, prayers, etc. She campaigned vigorously for guaranteed livable basic income and took immense pleasure in working with Bertha and Kate on what became For the Sake of the Common Good. She and Bertha were on speed dial. Apparently, it was quite something to behold. And as has been mentioned, she did not want a book about her, which was Bertha and Kate's original, completely generous and reasonable idea. But when my mum acquainted her with the concept of the Festschrift, a publication whose contributors honor the person being feted by writing about their own work, values, and commitments, which the honoree has inspired, she was all in. I know in hearing about it from both her and my mum how thrilled she was when each of you who contributed to the volume agreed to participate. It meant the world to her. Thank you very, very much. For the Sake of the Common Good, Essays in Honor of Lois Wilson, published to celebrate her 95th birthday, is a great gift. The Wilson family is tremendously grateful to everyone who made it all happen, including this launch, and especially, of course, to the extraordinary Kate Merriman and Bertha Yetman. When the pandemic was first declared, by going to live with my mom in Hamilton, my grandmother seized the opportunity not to be confined physically, of course, but also mentally, socially, imaginatively, and that, as all who know her can attest, is how she has always operated, to her credit and to our individual and collective benefit. Two recent instances of the impact her refusal to be confined to social strictures and expectations above all come to mind. First, a woman who, as a teenager, had been on one of the annual canoe trips to Quetico Provincial Park that my grandmother organized throughout the 1960s when she and my grandfather were serving ministry in Thunder Bay, made a point of visiting her this summer at our family camp on the north shore of Lake Superior, just east of Thunder Bay. This woman, like many others who came to know my grandmother through the church or in the larger community, Lois Wilson has always had a broad reach, regards her as a mentor and keeps in touch. All these individuals speak of how much they owe to her in the broadening of their horizons, their successful contention with the limitations of heteronormativity, and so much more. Second, at the June 19th Sunday service this year at Toronto's Royal York Road United Church, on the occasion of his retirement, one of the United Church of Canada's finest ministers, the Reverend Hans Van Nie, paid tribute to my grandmother as a key influence in his life. In sharing, quote, why in the world he would have chosen to spend a life working in the church, he cites a sermon in which she posed the question, to whom does the church belong? Her answer, quote, to the world, because God so loves the world. Hans elucidates as revolutionary, the ground of a better world, an economy in which people matter. Hans is characteristically understated, and when he calls Lois Wilson, quote, one of the exceedingly wise individuals in our United Church of Canada, wise without parallel, you know he means what he says. And what he says gets to the root of what our mother, grandmother, friend, and loved one in so many ways is all about, and why we honor and love her with a full heart, today and always.
Good evening. Good evening, and how good it is to hear those thoughtful reflections coming from Lois's daughter Jean and read by her granddaughter and namesake Lois. And while I'm at it, a special thanks to Kate and to Bertha. You're the ones with the vision, you're the ones who did the heavy lifting, and we have now a remarkable book, a most timely presentation to share with the world. First time I met Lois Wilson, do you remember? She had just hopped into a four-wheel drive that plowed through a blinding blizzard going over 100 kilometers, not 100 kilometers an hour, but that's the distance they went. And the reason, there was a church full of people, prairie people in the town where I was the ordinand, who were patiently waiting to meet and to hear their new moderator. And Lois didn't want to disappoint them, and she did not. And I was left thinking, who is this woman that even the prairie blizzards obey her? Those who welcomed Lois on her many journeys were often surprised to see that she was carrying with her only a simple backpack. But that was all you needed, Lois. By God's grace, you carried within yourself all that was required. I imagine us tonight opening up that backpack, and there's these fantastic words keep popping out. Authentic, prophetic, adventuresome, courageous, compassionate, curious, inspiring, insightful, infamous, dynamic, determined, divine, indescribable. And along with those adjectives, there come other words, the informal titles, not chancellor and moderator and president and so forth, senator, but boundary pusher, bridge builder, justice seeker, canoe paddler, advocate, champion, mentor, midwife, friend. You yourself have told us that at the heart of your own self-understanding, it is the Bible and the visionary stories within it that are the most key element for you. And we know that at your very core, there is a person of gratitude, a person who gives thanks for the one who gives you life and hope. And we give thanks as well this night. Folks, everyone knows that with Lois Wilson, action and reflection go hand in hand. So here's a snapshot of how Lois does theological reflection. A Sri Lankan Roman Catholic priest founded a center for studies in religion and society. Turns out to be a card table set in some obscure place. However, this priest is working with the most vulnerable. He's writing liberation theology. And so, of course, Lois dives right in and she reads avidly and she arranges to meet with this priest not once but on 2 occasions. And so it is, as she goes around the world, she keeps meeting these people that are doing theology, not based on a textbook, but on the life struggles of their own communities. She seeks out women living on the margins, and from those encounters gains some remarkable insights to share with us. And that, friends, is how Lois does theology. That's how she reflects, along with the occasional canoe ride in northwestern Ontario. And her actions are so many and diverse. She heads up Canadian government missions to North Korea and Sudan, to El Salvador and Guatemala. She serves in key positions in church and interfaith organizations worldwide and locally, and everything in between. She provides leadership on rights and democracy, on refugees, on nuclear waste management, on international peace and security. She befriends the mothers of May Square and those tortured for opposing apartheid and other horrible regimes. And she greatly values those friendships. I believe that one of her greatest values, however, is that of a messenger, a witness, a storyteller who lifts up those who struggle in other parts of the world as well as in our own neighborhoods. With the authority of one who pitches her tent among them, she paints vivid and disturbing scenes. She brings fresh insights. She introduces us to women and men unwaveringly faithful for the sake of the common good. Her messages, they evoke a deepened compassion within us. They reveal something of the very heart of God. And like her delightful, infectious laugh, her messages invite us to join in. At an Epiphany Exploration Conference, 2 hours before he was scheduled to appear, I received a phone call from the Keynote presenter. Can't make it. Airplane trouble. What are we going to do? I'm asking God, help me, give me wisdom. And then I look around and I see not a burning bush, I see Lois. and we have a little chat. Very soon, those 500 people who have come to this 4-day conference are reassembled. There's this great groan goes out as they hear the lead presenter can't be there. Refunds are offered. And then I say something to the effect, however, if you'd like to stay, Lois Wilson is here, and she's prepared to share with us some highlights of her many encounters around the world. No one leaves. And believe me, that settles them down. And from the beginning to her very last word that evening, you could hear a pin drop. That evening, Lois took us on a world tour that was both electrifying and deeply sacred. And people are still talking about it to this day. And no one requested a refund. And who but Lois would celebrate her 85th birthday by organizing a day-long symposium on what was the topic? Religion and public policy. And now here we are 10 years later with this wonderful celebration for the sake of the common good, in which others pick up themes and issues that have been so important throughout her life. So Lois, this evening we do honor you. We give thanks for the role that you have played in the life of so many communities. And with you, we give thanks for the one who gives you and all of us the gifts of life and hope. Amen.
Well, I thought that tonight was supposed to be about the common good, but there's an awful lot about me in it. But anyway, I obviously didn't do it by myself, and I'm so delighted that so many of you are here tonight that I've worked with over the years. I want to say a thank you to Rosedale congregation. This used to be, I came here for 10 years when I lived in the area, and to former friends, formerly closer friend, I haven't seen them for a long time, like Sandra Pitbledo and her friends who hosted the reception. And of course, a thank you to both Bertha and Kate, who were unrelenting, as you know, in putting this together. And then there are the contributors. Some of them are here and some of them aren't. I want to just say a bit about some of the ones that are here that I have known for many years. Alan was the one that made me go through that blizzard to his church. I wasn't going to go. And he said, you have to come, the church is full. And I said, to heck with you, but I had to go. So I went. So don't believe everything he said. Eric Weingartner, who spoke about the need for hope and his time in North Korea. I worked with Eric on North Korea, and as he knows, an experience that I had there in South Korea really changed the direction of my life and helped me to understand that human rights is absolutely central to the gospel, and it has to be unrelentingly supported. So thanks, Eric. Elia Hogman is here, I think, or she was. Are you here, Elia? Yeah, she's here. Okay. From Kingston. And she has written a chapter on Canadian Muslim women, which needs to be read, along with Diana Eck, who is a friend I met through the World Council, who is in charge of the Pluralism Project in Harvard University in the United States, which dealt with people of other faiths and the way we relate to others that are not of our exact persuasion. Bill Blakey wrote a chapter on faith and public policy. I got word yesterday, Bill lives in Winnipeg. He was Speaker of the House of Parliament for some time, was an NDP, and recently has been put into the hospital on palliative care. He had to have a leg removed a while back, so you might think about him and bear him up in your prayers. Alexa Gilmore is here, of course, dealing with the local congregation and telling me that it's going to go. She's resigned as minister of that congregation to start a new NGO, having discovered how to work in the community, and she's at that. Betsy Anderson is here. She has done a chapter on the laity, and that's what started me all on this journey. When we lived in Thunder Bay in '60, I noticed that the church paid all sorts of wonderful tributes to all the clergy, and I got so tired of it, they never said anything about the ministry of the laity. And I was laity. What was the matter with me? So that was one of my passions, and Betsy's got a good chapter on that. Mary Jo Letty, of course, is always something to make us think. Lloyd Axworthy, who is not here tonight, was in my congregation in Winnipeg, our first congregation, and I had the young people into the manse after Sunday church. We used to have Sunday services, and he said that he came to the group because he thought he could grow up the girls, but I wouldn't allow that. That I made him learn about international affairs and its relationship to the gospel. So we've been good friends ever since then. Stan Mackay, I'm so glad you're here, Stan, tonight. He's perhaps the only one here who knew my family, my mother and father, and my roots, and my need for immersion in the wilderness as part of my spirituality. Brent Hawks and Kim, whom I just met. I'm glad you're here, and I'm astonished by what you're doing internationally in that area. My friend Aruna Nanadasan from India, whom I met on my first trip to India in 1972, and I was over there for 3 months. I met somebody at some conference, and he said, "Can you come for 6 months?" And I said, "No, I've got 4 children, but I can come for 3 months." So that was my first time to outside of Canada, actually. And then Noah Aviv, Mendelssohn Aviv at Civil Liberties, of course, which I enjoyed very much, and Irwin Kotler. I must tell you, when Irwin came to, when I had met him in the 60s, in the 80s, around apartheid. We were on several panels deploring apartheid and destroying and so on. But when I was in the Senate, he was an MP and he was a backbencher, and he never got to do anything. And we used to meet every Friday night for dinner while he went on and on about how his son said to him, "Dad, why don't you quit? You're not doing anything in Parliament." And then he suddenly got elevated to Minister of Justice, and the rest is history. And Michael Blair, Michael I met actually in this church. He came to preach one Sunday, and I thought, wow, I got to get to know that guy. So I went up and did, and have known him ever since. And he emphasizes one of the current things I want to do, which is trying to animate people to support a guaranteed livable income for people below the poverty line, instead of all these short little handouts that they have to apply for and prove that they're poor. And my point is, I'm over 65 and I don't have to keep proving that I'm a senior citizen. My check arrives automatically. Why can't this happen for people under the poverty line? based on their tax returns. Anyway, one person who is not in the book is here tonight, Rachel Andrzejczyk, and she was my closest ally in the Senate. I asked her to write for this, but at the time she had serious health issues, and I'm just thrilled that she came tonight. When Chrétien appointed me to the Senate, he said, he didn't say, I don't care what you think, but I knew he didn't. All I wanted to know is, how are you going to vote? And I was so stupid at that time, I said, well, I think I'll probably vote Liberal. So that was good enough for him. But when I got into the Senate, I discovered that some of the best leaders were Conservative, of which Rachel was one. And I guess I voted as much with the Conservatives in the Senate as I did with the Liberals. So I just wanted to mention that because she is here tonight. And then my family, some of my grandchildren are here. 3 of them. Hold your hands up so they'll know who you are. And the reason that my family isn't here is we celebrated my birthday on my birthday last April. And they didn't want to celebrate twice. I don't know why. But anyway, Sarah and Megan and Lois, thanks for coming tonight. That's very much appreciated. So I guess it's launched, and I hope that this helps unite us and spurs us on to do some things together. It's obvious I didn't do anything on my own. It was always with other people. And you won't get anywhere if you're on your own. You know that. So we need to remember that. And just to finish up, there's a scripture passage in the book of Micah, the prophet Micah in the Old Testament, that is put to music in the United Church hymnal. And I'm going to teach it to you. I tried this once before and it didn't work, but I'm indefatigable. I'll try again. And it's the little part in Micah chapter 6, verse 8 that says, "What does the Lord require of you? What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God." And this is the way it goes. What does the Lord require of you? What does the Lord require of you? To do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with your God. He's going to help me out, I hope. A little higher. What does the Lord require of you? What does the Lord require of you? To do justice of you. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, justice, and love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Justice and love mercy, and walk humbly with your. Once more. What does the Lord require of you? What does the Lord require of you? To do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with your God. Thank you all.
Thank you. When I first got the notice that Lois had said that she wanted a chapter on the international LGBT rights movement and that she wanted me to write that chapter, I was filled with 2 immediate emotions, Lois. As someone who has fought for 40 years for LGBT people to have a place in the church, to be able to be open in the church. It felt like many times we had to fight to be on the inside, but not with you. You were inviting us in to be a part of your book. You were giving us voice, and it was an amazing, healing, wonderful moment when I got that notice. Thank you. But then I had my second emotion, which is sheer panic. And so I had to reach out to someone who knew more about what was going on internationally, because I knew a lot about the local church in Toronto and Canada, but the international movement was new for me. So I reached out to the most articulate, the most knowledgeable person on LGBT human rights, Kim Vance. And she had to leave early, and so it was her brilliance in the article. So on behalf of the LGBTQ movement for once again inviting us in, and on behalf of all of the other essayists for whom you gave voice in your book, thank you.
Hi, my name is Sean Mulrooney, and I'm a contributor to the book. And I'd like to lead you in wishing Lois a happy birthday. We're going to start in Ukrainian. For those of you who may not know Ukrainian, we're going to, the words are Mno Hayalita. And the hardest syllable is the first one. It's Mno. Can I hear you say Mno? Good. Mno Hayalita. Beautiful. And I'm going to sing the song through once, and then I will invite you to sing it with us. Mno Hayalita, Lita, Mno Hayalita. Mno Hayalita, Lita, Mno Hayalita. May you be blessed with health and salvation. God grant you many happy years. May you be blessed with health and salvation. God grant you many happy years. Mno Hayalita, Lita, Mno Hayalita. Mno Hayalita, Lita, Mno Hayalita. May you be blessed with health and salvation. God grant you many happy years. May you be blessed with health and salvation. God grant you many happy years.